Nebraska Territory, 1881. Sarah Colby sat at her father's old desk with a ledger open in front of her and a number at the bottom of the page that would not change no matter how many times she added it up. $38.50. That was what she owed Dr. Elias Hart for 4 months of visits and medicine for the fever that had taken her mother slowly through the worst part of the winter and left in its place only a debt Sarah had no earthly way of paying. Her father had died the spring before, drowned in a debt of his own, bad credit extended to half the county in a hard year, and a heart that gave out under the weight of trying to collect it. He'd left Sarah the store. He had also left her the debts nobody else in town seemed to feel obligated to settle, though they'd been happy enough to take his goods on credit while he was alive to extend it. She had spent that first year learning things she'd never wanted to know. Which neighbors paid promptly and which needed reminding twice, how long flour kept before it turned, how to smile at customers while doing arithmetic in her head about whether the month's takings would cover the month's owing. She had done it alone, mostly, with only Tommy for company in the small rooms above the store, and had told herself, most days, that alone was simply what her life had become, and there was no particular use in wishing it otherwise. She was 26 years old, unmarried, running a dry goods store that brought in just enough some months to keep the shelves stocked, and rarely enough to keep anything else caught up. $38.50. She had $4 in the tin box under the counter. She closed the ledger, put on her coat, and walked to Dr. Hart's office to tell him the truth before he had to come asking for it himself. Elias Hart was 34 years old, widowed 3 years, and had come to Nebraska Territory the way most doctors came to places like this, because somewhere needed one, and he had decided it might as well be somewhere that needed him more than it needed to be comfortable. He was in his office, cleaning instruments, when Sarah came in, and he set down what he was holding the moment he saw her face. "Miss Colby," Sarah said, "I've come to settle my account, and I'm afraid I have to tell you plainly that I can't. Not all of it. Not most of it, if I'm honest." She set a small stack of coins on his desk. $4, all she had. "I know it isn't near enough. I wanted you to hear it from me instead of finding it out through the ledger." Elias looked at the $4 for a long moment, and then at her. "I appreciate you telling me straight," Sarah said. "Most people in this town would have let me chase it." "I'm not most people," Sarah said, with more steel in it than she'd meant to show. "No," Elias said, and something in his face shifted, not quite a smile. "I don't imagine you are." He was quiet for a moment, turning something over. "I have an idea," he said finally, "and I want you to hear the whole of it before you say anything, because I know how it's going to sound at first." Sarah waited. "Marry me," Elias said, "and the debt is settled the day we do. Not because I'm holding it over you. I'd forgive it outright if you asked me to, this minute, and think no less of you. I'm saying it because I've thought for some time that I'd like to marry you, Miss Colby, and I didn't know how to say so without it sounding like exactly what it's going to sound like right now." Sarah stared at him. "That is the strangest proposal I believe anyone in this territory has ever received," she said. "I imagine so," Elias said. "You don't have to answer today. I'd rather you didn't, honestly. I'd rather you thought about it properly, and not because you owe me anything. I want to stop here and say something, because I think it's worth sitting with. A lesser man in Elias Hart's position might have let the debt do his asking for him, might have let need stand in for courtship. He didn't. He put both things on the table separately, the money and the feeling, so she'd never have to wonder which one she was actually agreeing to. Sarah did not answer him that day, or the next, or the one after that. She went home and told her younger brother, Tommy, 10 years old and the only family she had left in the house, that Dr. Hart had made her an odd sort of offer, and Tommy had looked up from his supper with the particular directness of a boy who has not yet learned to be tactful about anything. "Are you going to say yes?" he asked. "I don't know," Sarah said. He fixed Mama for free the last 2 weeks before she died, Tommy said, even though we already owed him plenty. I heard him tell you not to worry about it. Sarah had not known Tommy had heard that. He's not asking because of the money, is he? It was not really a question. No, Sarah admitted. I don't believe he is. Tommy went back to his supper, apparently satisfied he'd said what needed saying, and Sarah sat with the truth of it a good deal longer than her brother seemed to need to. She did not give Elias an answer, but she also did not stay away from him, and over the following weeks, without either of them naming what was happening anyway, a kind of courtship began anyway. Built, as it turned out, on exactly the small, ordinary things Sarah had least expected from a man who'd made such an unusual first offer. There was the week her roof began leaking over the store's storeroom, and Elias arrived unasked on a Saturday with a ladder and a bundle of shingles and spent the whole afternoon up there while Sarah brought him water and tried, without much success, to insist she'd have gotten to it eventually herself. I don't doubt it, Elias said, hammering a shingle into place. I had the afternoon free anyway. You didn't have to spend it on my roof, Sarah said. No, I agreed. I didn't. And did not stop working. There was the evening Tommy came down with a bad cough, and Elias arrived within the hour of being sent for, sat with the boy until well past midnight, though the cough was nothing serious, and refused, flatly, to accept payment for the visit. You already owe me for 1 winter's worth of doctoring, he said, packing his bag to leave. I'm not adding a second. That isn't how a business is meant to run, Sarah said. No, it's how I'm meant to run mine, apparently. There was the Sunday she found, folded neatly on the store counter with no note attached, a bolt of good wool cloth, enough to make Tommy a proper winter coat, his old one having gone thin at the elbows and short at the wrist over the past year of growing. She knew immediately where it had come from. She also knew, from the careful lack of a note, that Elias had not wanted thanks for it, only for Tommy to have a coat that fit. She thanked him anyway, the next time she saw him, and watched him look faintly uncomfortable in the particular way of a man unused to being caught doing something kind on purpose. There was, too, the quieter accumulation of ordinary evenings, Elias stopping by the store some nights after his rounds, not for any particular reason, just to sit a while on the porch step while Sarah closed up, talking about nothing especially important, the two of them settling into a familiarity that had nothing to do with the debt that had started it and everything to do with what had grown in its place. He'd tell her some evenings about patients he'd treated that day, careful never to say more than a doctor should, and she found she looked forward to those small, unremarkable stories more than she was entirely comfortable admitting to herself. There was the week in August when the store's ledgers themselves became a small point of quiet partnership. Elias, noticing Sarah squinting over her father's old handwriting late one evening, sat down beside her without being asked and spent 2 hours helping her recopy the accounts into a clearer hand, not because he had any particular skill for bookkeeping, but because he seemed constitutionally unable to watch her struggle with something alone when he could sit beside her instead. You don't have to help with this, too, Sarah said, around the 3rd hour, when her eyes had gone tired and his handwriting had gotten progressively worse from fatigue. I know, he said, not looking up from the column he was adding. I like sitting here more than I like being at my own kitchen table by myself. That's the whole of it, if you want the honest reason. There was the Saturday Tommy's old fishing pole finally snapped beyond repair, and Elias, hearing about it secondhand from the boy's disappointed retelling at supper, arrived the following week with a new one, not extravagant, simply well-made, and spent an entire Sunday afternoon teaching Tommy to cast properly at the creek behind the store, the two of them coming back sunburned and pleased with themselves, having caught, by Tommy's insistent count, nearly enough for supper, which turned out to be 2 small fish that Sarah cooked anyway, with as much ceremony as if they'd been a proper haul. There was the afternoon a bad summer storm rolled through, and Elias, caught at the store when it broke, stayed to help her carry stock away from a window that had begun to leak, the two of them soaked through and laughing, for the first time since her father's death, over something as small as a ruined sack of flour. "You got flour in your hair," Elias said, still laughing. "You've got it on your whole coat," Sarah said, and neither of them moved to fix it for a long moment, simply standing there in the wet storeroom, something passing between them that had very little to do with weather. By late summer, Sarah had stopped thinking of the $38.50 as a debt at all. She had started thinking of it instead of the strange, unlikely beginning of something she had not let herself want since before her father died, the plain, steady presence of a person who showed up again and again without being asked and without keeping count of what it cost him to do it. It was Tommy again, in the end, who said the thing that made the shape of it undeniable. It was a Tuesday evening in September, the two of them shelling beans on the porch while Elias mended a hinge on the storeroom door inside. "Tommy tells me you fix things that aren't broken, so you've got a reason to stay," she said. Elias stayed still, the hinge forgotten in his hand. "He's not wrong," Elias admitted after a moment. "I ran out of legitimate reasons around July. I've been inventing them since." "Why didn't you just say so?" "Because I already asked you to marry me once over a debt," Elias said. "I didn't much like how that sounded even as I was saying it, and I didn't want to make the same mistake twice, offering you a solution to a problem instead of simply telling you plainly what I want, which has nothing to do with any debt at all." "Then tell me plainly." Elias set down the hinge entirely. "I want to marry you," he said, "because you told me the truth about $4 when it would have been easier to avoid me. Because you laughed with flour in your hair during the storm that ruined half your stock. Because your brother is wiser than either of us and has apparently been managing my courtship better than I have. I don't want to marry you to settle an account, Sarah. I want to marry you because I've come to need you being part of my days, and I'd like that to be true for the rest of them." The complication came, as it often does, from a man who meant no harm and simply saw an opportunity where he thought one existed. His name was Harlan Bixby, who owned the largest freight operation in the county and had recently come into a fair bit of money moving supplies for the railroad survey crews. He was not unkind, only accustomed to solving problems with money because it had always worked for him before. He came to the store on a Thursday, having heard, as everyone eventually hears everything in a small town, that Sarah Colby was in some manner of debt to the doctor and considering an unusual arrangement to settle it. "I'll pay off whatever you owe Hart outright," Harlan said without much preamble. "And I'd consider it an investment, Miss Colby, if you'd think favorably on a match between us. I can offer you a good house, help with the store, no more worrying over ledgers. I don't see why a woman in your position should have to marry out of necessity to a man of modest means when there's a better offer sitting right in front of her." It was not cruel. It was, in its own transactional way, generous, and it landed, for one uncomfortable moment, exactly where Harlan intended it to, squarely on the fear Sarah had been carrying since her father's death, that every decision she made about her future was really just a decision about which debt to trade for which. "I need to think on it," she told him, which was at that moment entirely true. Harlan, for his part, seemed to consider the matter as good as settled. He called again the following week, this time at the store itself, and spoke to Sarah with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to his offers being accepted. "I've already spoken with Hart about the sum," Harlan said, adjusting his hat. "No hard feelings on his end, I'd wager. A man in his position understands a practical arrangement when he sees one. I only need your word, Miss Colby, and I'll have the papers drawn up by Monday." "You haven't had my word yet," Sarah said, more sharply than she intended. Harlan blinked, seeming genuinely surprised that this required saying aloud. "Of course. Forgive me. I only meant to have things ready, so you needn't trouble yourself with the details." It was, Sarah realized later, exactly the trouble. A man so certain that removing her from the details of her own life counted as a kindness that he hadn't thought to ask whether she wanted them removed at all. She thought about it for the better part of a week, and the thinking was harder than she expected, because Harlan's offer was not foolish. A house paid for outright, no debts, no ledger kept awake at night. She had spent a year since her father's death doing arithmetic that never worked out, and here was a man offering to simply make the arithmetic stop mattering at all. She thought, too, about Elias, about a bolt of wool cloth left with no note, about a hinge mended 3 times over for no reason but the excuse to stay, about the particular quality of quiet in a man's voice when he told a 10-year-old boy he needn't worry about a debt on top of a debt. She thought about the difference between a man who wanted to erase her problems from her life and a man who had simply, patiently shown up beside her while she solved them herself. She thought about the evening with the ledgers, Elias's handwriting growing steadily worse as the hours wore on, and how he had never once suggested she simply hand the whole business over to someone more capable of managing it, had only ever sat beside her, correcting a column here and there, letting the work stay hers, while making sure she didn't have to do it entirely alone. She thought about her father and the debts he'd extended too freely to a whole county because he believed people ought to be trusted rather than merely managed, and wondered, uncomfortably, whether Harlan's tidy solution was really generosity or simply another version of being managed, kindly, but managed all the same. And she understood, sitting at her father's old desk with the ledger closed in front of her, that the difference between Harlan Bixby and Elias Hart was not the size of the offer. It was that one man had offered to remove her problems from her life, and the other had offered to be present inside it, debts and storms and leaking roofs and all, without once asking her to be smaller or safer than she already was. She found Elias at his office on a Friday evening, the same office where all of this had started with $4 and an apology. "Harlan Bixby offered to pay off what I owe you and marry me himself," Sarah said. Elias's jaw tightened, but he only said, "And?" "I'm not going to accept," Sarah said. "I wanted you to hear that from me directly, the same way I came to tell you about the $4 myself all those months ago." She stepped closer. "He offered to make my problems disappear, Elias. You never once did that. You just kept showing up in the middle of them, fixing a roof, mending a hinge that didn't need it, sitting with my brother past midnight over a cough that wasn't serious. I don't want a life where my troubles get erased by somebody else's money. I want a life where somebody stands in the middle of them with me. I've had that these past months with you. I'd like it to keep being true." "I meant every word I said on that porch," Elias said, his voice rough. "I know," Sarah said. "That's rather the whole point." They married in November in the small church at the edge of town, with Tommy standing at her sister's side looking, according to everyone who attended, entirely too pleased with himself for a boy of 10. It was a quiet wedding. Neither of them wanted a large one. Sarah wore her mother's good dress, taken in slightly at the waist, and Elias wore his one good coat and looked throughout the ceremony like a man still faintly amazed at his own good fortune. Harlan Bixby sent a wedding gift, a set of good china, generous and without resentment, and married within the year a widow from the next county over who was, by every account, glad of exactly the arrangement he had to offer. Sarah heard the news and found she was genuinely happy for him. He had never meant unkindness. He had simply been solving a problem the only way he knew how, and it was no fault of his that Sarah needed something his money couldn't buy. 3 years later, on a quiet evening in early autumn, Sarah stood behind the counter of the store, larger now, restocked and thriving in a way it hadn't since her father's healthiest years, and watched through the window as Elias walked up the street from his office, Tommy, 13 now, walking beside him, carrying his medical bag with the particular seriousness of a boy who had decided sometime in the past year that he intended to become a doctor himself one day. The storeroom door hinge, mended so many unnecessary times that first autumn, still worked perfectly. Sarah had never had it replaced. She liked, some evenings, running her thumb over the worn spot where Elias's hand had rested on it so many times, tightening screws that were never really loose. There was a ledger on the desk in the back room, kept faithfully now, and it had not shown a debt in Sarah's name in nearly 3 years. It showed, instead, the steady, unremarkable arithmetic of 2 people building something together. The store's earnings, the household accounts, small figures that added up, finally, to something that worked. The bolt of wool cloth Elias had left with no note that first summer had long since become Tommy's winter coat, worn through 2 full seasons and passed down this past year to a neighbor's younger boy when Tommy outgrew it. A small, unremarkable kindness that had simply kept traveling outward the way kindnesses tended to travel once they'd been given without expectation of anything returned. Elias Hart came through the door first, setting down his bag, and found Sarah watching him with the same quiet attention she'd given him that very first day in his office when she'd set $4 on his desk and told him the plain truth rather than let him find it out another way. "You've got that look," he said. "What look?" "Like you're doing arithmetic," he said, smiling. "I am. It's just finally coming out right." I've thought a good deal telling you this story about the difference between a debt and a gift, and how easily the two can be confused by two entirely well-meaning people. Elias Hart could have let money do his asking for him. He didn't. He put the truth on the table plainly, separate from anything owed, and let Sarah choose him freely, on her own time, for her own reasons. I think that's the real lesson buried in this one. The people worth building a life with aren't the ones who erase our troubles for us. They're the ones who show up inside them again and again, mending a hinge that was never really broken, simply because it gives them one more reason to stay. Thank you for spending this evening with Sarah and Elias, and with me. If their story kept you good company tonight, that's all I ever hope for in the telling. Until next time, keep listening.